Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I'm Liz Cohen, I'm Dean of the Institute, and I am delighted to welcome you today to our conference on women in biotech. The Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study is a unique intellectual community where scholars, scientists, and artists work at the forefront of their disciplines and across academic boundaries. It fosters an intellectual climate of both daring and rigor, characteristics that are shared with the fast-evolving field of biotech. At Radcliffe, we are also deeply committed to sharing advanced work with the public through conferences like this one. We at Radcliffe are proud of our rich tradition of programming in the sciences. That tradition harkens back to Mary Ingram Bunting, the fifth president of Radcliffe College and founder of our forerunner, the Radcliffe Institute for Independent Study. Bunting was a microbiologist. More recently, my predecessor as dean was a computer scientist, Barbara Gross, whom I am so pleased to have with us here today. I also want to acknowledge and extend sincere thanks to Dr. Nancy Hopkins of MIT. Nancy, who's also here in attendance today, inspired this conference, just as she has inspired and encouraged women in the sciences through her life and her work. I also want to thank our panelists who have come from lecture halls, labs, and boardrooms to think about women in biotech with us today. Radcliffe's deep commitment to the sciences manifests itself in a number of ways this fall. We have many impressive scientists among the year's 50 fellows. Our annual science symposium will consider the past, present, and future of DNA on Friday, October 2nd. And we will continue our inquiry into genetic and microbiological questions over the course of this academic year with our science lecture series. You can see these events and many more of our fall offerings listed on the calendar cards that we've placed on your chairs. And we also encourage you to check out our website to keep apprised of the many opportunities we offer to engage with interesting, important, and timely issues. The topic of biotech is intriguing for many reasons. Since Stanford scientist Herbert Boyer teamed up with venture capitalist Robert Swanson in 1976 to found the Genentech Corporation, biotech has been at the nexus of cutting-edge laboratory science and venture capital. The commercialization of recombinant DNA technology has altered relationships between universities, government, and industry. In our daily lives, it has changed and will continue to change in profound ways how we eat, how we grow things, and how we heal. Another reason that biotech is an exciting field is that there are women in leadership positions, and there have been from the very beginning. When H. Stewart Parker graduated from the University of Washington in 1981, she was hired as the very first employee of Immunex Corporation in Seattle. From that start, she went on to serve the biotech industry as vice president of corporate development, president, CEO, director, chairman, and lobbyist. Her career makes the point that right from the start of the biotechnology industry, there have been women leading it. I know that we have some of them in the audience here today, and we will hear from others as we listen to this afternoon's panels. But how many are there? In 2001, a study revealed that women made up about 10% of senior leadership in top biotech firms. That study acknowledged that the number was a little low, but it also exuded confidence that with so many scientifically talented women in the pipeline, those numbers were sure to soar. In some ways, numbers have climbed. More women than men now attend college. More women than men study biology at the undergraduate and graduate levels. And more than half of all biology PhDs today are earned by women. Women are not as well represented on science faculties in universities, but they make up an increasing proportion at the assistant rank. So 26% of biology faculty at MIT are women. At Harvard, women constitute 30% of tenured and tenure-track biology professors within the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. While all these changes have been happening in academia, the practice of science itself has been altering in some other quite significant ways. Most notably, scientific research has been increasingly privatized and commercialized. What that means is that today's most significant advances are just as likely to happen in a privately owned lab geared toward profit as they are in a nonprofit, educational, or governmental setting. Corporate, whether venture capital, particularly venture capital sponsorship, means that big breakthroughs and big money are now very likely to be made in the same place. So how many women are in that place? How have all the optimistic predictions made in 2001 that the 10% number was about to take off panned out? Well, a study of senior leadership in top biotech firms in 2014 found that women comprised, are you ready? 10%. Where that 10% can be found is also revealing. Massachusetts Biotech Research Council data showed that most senior women are in communications, human resources, and development. Important roles, to be sure, but still not the same as directors, chief financial officers, or chief executives. Studies show that the absence of women does not arise from any lack of ambition on women's parts, and this is very important. In a 2014 survey of industry leaders, equal percentages of men and women identified being named to a board as a personal goal. Yet, while 59% of the men surveyed had been invited to join a board, only 16% of the women had. But don't worry, the 2014 study assures us, there are so many talented women in the pipeline that the numbers are about to skyrocket. The numbers were supposed to do that in 2001, but now, almost a decade and a half later, they still have not. So where are all those eagerly awaited women in biotech? Thanks to the work of Nancy Hopkins, we have learned that they are not on boards of directors or on scientific advisory boards. Hopkins used data from a Kauffman Family Foundation report to demonstrate that only about 5 to 8% of those bodies consist of women. So what is stopping up this pipeline of women in the biotech industry? One recent incident that got a lot of press offers a clue. Dr. Tim Hunt of the UK holds a Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for his work on cell division. At the World Conference of Science Journalists in South Korea this past June, Dr. Hunt stated publicly that, and I'm quoting him, girls were nothing but trouble in science. And here's what he said. 3 things happen when they are in the lab. You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry. End quote. Well, that kind of attitude could well be part of what is blocking the promised pipeline. Women facing prejudice in science is not a new topic, of course, and concern about it is not new either. In 1994, the journal Science ran a 3-part series on women in science. At that time, editor-in-chief Daniel E. Koshland reflected, and I'm quoting him, although many formal barriers to women's participation in science have fallen, cultural attitudes and antagonisms remain, end quote. Nobel laureate Hunt certainly proves that statement to be true. Koshland further wondered, more than 20 years ago, in another quote, if society can afford to underutilize the abilities of half of its citizens. More recently, a team of researchers led by Laurel Smith-Doerr, who's here with us today, found that, and I quote, women are currently and have historically been underrepresented in top leadership positions in biotech policymaking, research, and management. Without equal input from both men and women in decision-making, solutions to today's intractable problems are unlikely to be optimal. Even more bluntly, the study warned, and I quote, "We are missing out on talented leadership and on diversity in leadership that could be readily achieved." Missing out indeed. A recent independent report entitled "The Bottom Line, Corporate Performance and Women's Representation on Boards" found that companies, including Fortune 500 companies, with 3 or more women on their boards outperform their counterparts with fewer women in all ways, including financial success. That evidence deserves a wide hearing. And it is likely that one of the significant pressures keeping women out of biotech boardrooms is the dependence of startups on venture capitalists, who may take risks in certain areas, but who are risk-averse in others, like gender equity. Let's make sure that money talks in this conversation. We seem, in conclusion, to be facing a clear problem of talent underutilization in the burgeoning world of biotech. No field, no country, no society can afford to squander the talents of half of its population. Science certainly cannot. At Radcliffe, we have known that to be true all the way back to the days of Mary Bunting. So what better place to ask questions about where women in biotech have been, where they are now, and where we want them to be in 10 years' time. I hope we will leave this room today not only with a deeper understanding of the obstacles to women's participation, but also with new insights into how we can turn things around. To get our conversation started, I'd now like to hand things over to Professor Dan Carpenter. Dan is the Faculty Director of Social Science Programs at the Radcliffe Institute, and he is also the Allie S. Freed Professor of Government in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. So, Dan.
Thank you, Liz. I'm proud that Radcliffe today hosts a conversation that brings some of the best and brightest minds from academia, industry, and other domains to talk about a critical problem facing not only our system of science, but also our economy and one of its most important industries. Dean Cohen has just outlined the parameters of that problem, and you're going to hear much, much more in the hours that follow. We at Radcliffe recognize, of course, that the gender gap in biotech is a complex problem, and that the facts on the ground are changing as we meet and speak today. Our panelists, indeed, are also well aware of the fluid nature of this problem and, of course, of the enduring structural disparities that continue to shape the biotechnology industry. The Radcliffe Institute excels at the interdisciplinary. There's a lot of talk at various universities about breaking out of boxes, busting out of silos, a lot of talk about the importance of getting interdisciplinary, but in my 20-year experience in the academy, there is not a single place that does it as well as Radcliffe. And that's what the kind of event that we're going to bring to you today. Some of the panelists you will hear from today are life scientists who have had scientific training and experiences in the life sciences industry for decades. The social science panelists you will hear today are trained sociologists, psychologists, and management specialists, and they have themselves spent decades studying this industry in depth, and others like it. We're going to hear from scientists, but also from those who study the careers of scientists. We're going to hear from biotech entrepreneurs, but also those who study systematically and with very granular data the operations and successes or failures of biotech firms. Before turning to the first panel, let me transition by way of a story. I've written some on the Food and Drug Administration and on food and drug law and the regulations governing the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries. And a few years ago, I had the privilege of serving on a United States Institute of Medicine, or IOM, committee examining issues in the pharmaceutical industry. The report was commissioned by the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates all of the companies and the people who invent and produce the products that together make up the biotech world that we know. When it came time to deliver the report to the FDA, my colleagues and I met with the commissioner of the FDA and the top staff of the agency. On one side of the table, the IOM committee. On the other side, the FDA, not in an adversarial setting, but in one of deliberation where the roles of each side were clearly delineated. Here's what I remember so clearly. Not a single person on the FDA side of that table that day was a man. Not just the commissioner, Margaret Hamburg, but also the various associate commissioners, the scientific staff, the legal staff, and the others. I wasn't the only one who noticed this. As one of my fellow committee members, there were several of them, had spent a lot of time at the FDA, he turned to me and said, 20 years ago, Dan, we would have been sitting across from a lineup of guys, and a much less stellar crew than this one at that. I'm not going to name that gentleman, but I think he was probably right. Now keep in mind this, the business biotech model rests and will continue to rest no matter what changes happen under current legislation on company sponsors persuading the FDA that their products are safe and effective. Quite beyond the important ethical, social, and economic issues at stake today, there is a business and management issue. Unless we think that gender diversity has nothing to do with the ability to make a case, how sustainable a business model, how sustainable an arrangement is it for an industry whose higher echelons are populated overwhelmingly by men to make a business life or death case to an agency increasingly staffed by the best and brightest women? I'll leave that for you to ponder. Our symposium today proceeds in two parts, the problem and possible solutions to it. The first is entitled Defining and Analyzing the Problem. That's the panel to my left. Then after a break, Solutions and Strategies, what works and what has not, followed by closing remarks by my esteemed colleague Janet Rich Edwards. To kick off the first panel on problem definition, I'm going to turn to Professor Monica Edwards, who's written some of the most insightful early work on the history of the Monica Higgins, insightful work on the early biotech industry. She is Kathleen McCartney Professor of Education Leadership at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Monica, thank you and welcome to the Radcliffe Institute.
Thank you. Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. There we go, warming ourselves up because we are all here to tackle the challenges, the problem, and to think of some solutions to move us forward in this space. I want to thank the Radcliffe Institute for inviting all of us. Thank you so much. Looking forward to an exciting afternoon. My name is Monica Higgins. I'm a faculty member, as Dan said, right across the green there at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm delighted to be here. You actually have the bios of the panelists right in your program, but I'm going to introduce them very briefly, and then I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves via their ideas and their work, okay? So first of all, immediately to my left, we have Laurel Smith-Doerr, who is a professor of sociology. She's also the director of the Social Science Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and she has done some fabulous research using lots and lots of data, looking at academics and science, and really looking at gender gaps over time. I've been an admirer of her academic work for a very long time, so we welcome your perspective, large-scale kind of perspective on this problem. And then Deborah Dunsire, who takes a very different perspective, of course, because she comes from practice and has spent years working in the field in this industry. She is the president and CEO of Forum Pharmaceuticals, and prior to that, she was the CEO of Millennium Pharmaceuticals for many years. So to say that she has broken through is quite the understatement. So appreciate having you here and looking forward so much to hearing your thoughts on this problem and just your own experience as well. Alison Wood-Brooks comes to us from the Harvard Business School. She's a faculty member there, and she takes a different approach to thinking about this. Her perspective is more of a psychological perspective. She studies person perception, social cognition. She's very interested in kind of the early phases of entrepreneurship. How do you get your good ideas out there? How do you make pitches? And are there gender differences? And while she's not especially focused on biopharma, you're going to hear from her in her research, and we're going to think about how her work actually applies to this, the complexities of this field. So she provides a different angle as well. Now, all of us are taking a learning stance, and we're here for different reasons. I know we have scholars, practitioners, people curious in the room. From my perspective, so I'm an academic, but about 10 years ago, I published a book called Career Imprints, the creation of leaders across an industry. And I was focused on biotech, and I looked at how a healthcare company called Baxter Travenol spawned a disproportionate number of entrepreneurs, I argued, at the dawn of the biotech industry. So back in the 1970s, early 80s. And the thing of it was that the people I was studying were all men. In fact, my colleagues over at HBS, where I was before the ed school, nicknamed this project the Baxter Boys Project. They're all guys, all men. And you could say, well, Monica, this was during the 1970s. Of course, you didn't have very many women in senior leadership positions anyway. And in fact, Lizabeth Moss-Cantor's book, Men and Women of the Corporation, came out in 1974. So, okay, maybe there were some structural barriers at that time. But listening to Liz and kind of thinking about the numbers, we know that there is still underrepresentation. So the first panel today, we are really here to try and get a handle on this. What are some of the underlying root causes, but also just to understand it better before we move to the second session. So the game plan is that I am going to turn the floor over to our three panelists, and I'm going to ask them for their views on what is the problem as they see it, and they will have 15 minutes each, and some of them have slides, some don't, and that's fine, and they are welcome up here. And so they'll have 15 minutes with no interruptions whatsoever in between, so no questions at all. And so we'll just hear from them back to back. Then I get a chance to ask them questions first off. So I'm probably going to ask just one question of each of them because we really want to hear from you. So the way that's going to work is there's a mic right in the middle of the floor, and after I ask my questions, and that will take about 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to turn it over to you, and you're going to come to the middle of the floor, and you're going to go to the mic, and you're just going to state your name and your affiliation and your question. So for example, Monica Higgins, I am a professor at the ed school, and I have a question for Deborah. Okay, so that way we can get in a lot of questions. And then I will signal when it's the very end, the last question, and we'll move to a close, and then we'll continue the conversation over break. Okay? So again, welcome. Thank you all for being here. And Laurel, take it away.
Great. So thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks to Liz and Dan for the invitation, and to all the organizers. I'm really excited about this event today. And so I've been invited to talk about some of my past research on gender equity in biotech. I'm a sociologist, so I'm very interested in the social contexts in which people find themselves. My research has looked at which social contexts are conducive to gender equity, and so I'll talk today about a sociological question of where women find more opportunities in the life sciences, looking particularly at the types of organizations that are more conducive to gender equity. And so it was great that Liz kicked us off with thinking about sort of what's going on at the very top of biotech organizations. I'm going to start by talking out more about what's going on in the labs and how women have more authority in certain kinds of lab settings than others. And then I'll get to the question of the leadership and founders of firms. So here we go. Let's see if I can. Great. So I'm starting from organizational theory, particularly from Woody Powell's contribution, in which he contrasted forms of economic organization, two of which are network organizations and hierarchies. So where hierarchies' main mode of communication is routines in the network form, communication happens through relationships, conflict is resolved in hierarchy more by rank and authority. So boss says who wins. In the network organizations, it's more by reputation and reciprocity. And where hierarchy has a more formal tone, network organizations are more open-ended and tend toward collective benefits rather than following the rules to move up the job ladder. And in the life sciences, which is where I did my study, biotech firms are based that work on human therapies are how we measured network organizations, so the sort of small entrepreneurial biotech firms, in contrast to the more hierarchical large multinational pharmaceutical corporations and universities, which are more hierarchical. And so the question is, what does that kind of variation mean for women in science? And there are two different kinds of hypotheses in the social science literature, so it kind of goes both ways. On the one hand, there's research that says bureaucratic rules are better for combating discrimination, so the threat of a lawsuit. And there's some research, for example, on minorities in the Army that shows that having a bureaucratic structure can actually be good for racial integration in large bureaucracies. On the other hand, social scientists like Cantor, who Monica just mentioned, have long noted informal organization does not always match the formal organization. So the larger the bureaucracy, the larger the shadow side that's cast. And that can make more room for informal stereotypes and sort of the old boy networks. So here I was faced with this literature that said, well, maybe on the one hand, it's better to have bureaucracy, and on the other hand, maybe it's better to have these kind of network organizations. So, of course, being a good sociologist, I turned to the data. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some data that I collected long ago, which began with my dissertation. So I feel like maybe I'm turning into the historian. Liz gave us the current stuff, and I'm going back in time, given that some of these findings are now from what people consider the early days of biotech. But the organizers told me that this context of the past still has some relevance for our basic understanding of social processes, and the theory would still be interesting and relevant for our conversation today. So the first set of findings I'll tell you about are for life scientists working in the 1990s through 2000, and this is a national sample of scientists, and I did a smaller set of interviews during that time with scientists working in the Western United States. And then the second set of data comes from work that I did with Kirsten Whittington, where she matched patent data to my sample to see if we could find a gender gap in patenting across the different kinds of organizational settings. And then finally, I'll tell you about a study of Massachusetts biotechnology firm founders and leadership that was sponsored by the Immigrant Learning Center in 2007. They wanted to know about foreign-born founders, but they let me add a question about women founders to the survey. So what do I find? So for the first question about what's going on in the labs and who's really leading the science, in these models, controlling for the years since PhD was granted and the prestige of the PhD program, which is a whole other story that I can answer questions about, we can see the usual gender gap in hierarchical settings of academia and the large drug companies. Women scientists' odds of leading a lab are lower than their male colleagues. But women are more likely to have leadership roles in biotech firms. And so I found that the magnitude of that effect was quite large, that women in biotech were almost 8 times more likely to lead than women PhDs in more hierarchical settings like academia or multinational pharmaceutical companies. And there was no significant difference for men in the probability of being sort of the head of the lab and determining where the science was going. All right, and then in terms of patenting, in these analyses that I did with Whittington, we found that patent productivity in biotech also exhibited greater gender equity compared to more hierarchical settings. So on these slides, I don't know if you can read it in the back, but the light gray bar is men's propensity to patent, and the black bar is women's propensity to patent. And you can see that there are large, significant gaps for the large industrial settings. That's the first set of bars is for pharma. The second set is government and nonprofit and research hospitals. The third set is academia. And then the only place where there's actually no significant difference, even though it looks like women are out patenting their male colleagues, it's actually not a significant difference, there's gender parity in the biotech firms. So we can see that this is a place where we do find some gender equity when we're talking about sort of scientists who are in the labs. And then, so I wanted to understand why this was, right? Here are these two different kinds of organizations, network organizations and hierarchies. And what is it that makes for greater equity in these kinds of biotech firms? So I turned to my interview data, and I identified 3 different reasons why my respondents talked about the equity in biotech firms. The first was flexibility. And so this first quote is from a female respondent who had been an academic and unexpectedly did not receive tenure, but was very successful in biotech management. And for confidentiality reasons, I cannot identify her, but you would know her name. So she is describing how women are not just forced out, but sometimes voluntarily leave academe for biotech, at least in this period during the 1990s. And a lot of the reasons why, at least she said, her women colleagues left academe was because they had more of a choice, more flexibility in who they could work with in the biotech industry. So here's the quote. A friend of mine left a tenured position at, I can't say the university, elite university, to go to a biotech firm. She called the university department under, and she named this guy, which I don't give his name here, under so-and-so, an autocracy. She just wanted to do science, didn't care about the prestige, and could do science at the biotech firm, working with who she wanted to rather than dealing with this guy. The second theme that I heard in many interviews, so this is just one example of many interviews that talked about the same trend, was the transparency in biotech. So this is a quote from a senior scientist at a very profitable biotech firm, talking about her experience there as opposed to her academic experience. She said, I could tell you from my experience in academia, many a true story about political infighting, and she went on to give some examples, which I don't give here. At this biotech firm, we are not compartmentalized and get to work with many good scientists both here and outside the firm, and we choose who to work with based on non-financial considerations, like how good they are in their field. So these kind of transparent, permeable boundaries of biotech seem to shine light on perhaps some of the political infighting, and the reputation that people have for collaboration matters, and because of that visibility, that, at least these respondents argued, aids in gender equity. The third kind of theme that came from the interviews was about collective rewards. So this is a quote that discusses how collaboration in biotech also means that scientists are rewarded for their collective contributions, that there are some mutual benefits, which may also mean some flexibility for life events. This particular scientist had just filed an important patent and sent off the paper to the New England Journal of Medicine the day before she delivered her baby. And her project team sort of really kept her in the loop. They gained a lot of resources from it, but she was part of that, you know, sort of collective reward that they got for this major breakthrough that they made. And doing that allowed her to sort of have some social capital with her collaborators, and they sort of took up the slack while she was taking time off to be with her baby. So she said, while I was on maternity leave here at this firm, I could keep in touch with my colleagues who kept the project moving forward, and she contrasted that to academia. When I was a postdoc, people collaborated somewhat on the fringes of their work, but still had their main turf, which they guarded carefully. So she's contrasting academic life science, where collaboration, sure, it's important, but the collective goals and the rewards are not as central to actually the life of the organization in the same way that she identified in biotech firms. All right, so on to the question about the founders. What about the people who start up firms? And this was a study, again, in Massachusetts with about 300 different firms. This was research that I conducted with Jim McQuaid and Dan Monty here in Massachusetts. And what we found, just in case you're curious about the foreign-born founders, that's another really important kind of diversity in entrepreneurship. And so here you can see that that first turquoise bar is at the time, the percent of life scientists who were foreign-born working in the US was about 21%, and 42% of the firms we surveyed had at least one immigrant founder. So here's another data point for the importance of immigration, just as a little side note. And then there's less gender equity, though, at the founder level. In our survey, at least, of New England biotech firms, about 21% had at least one woman founder, so maybe we're doing better in New England than in some other studies. And so that dark green bar on the far right shows that, and it's in contrast to the taller dark green bar that shows that 42% of the national life science labor force are women. So women are underrepresented, certainly, in founding biotech firms. Even here, although, you know, it's also relative, there's definitely room for improvement in thinking about who are the founders of biotech firms. But at least in terms of patenting and leadership in the labs, women life scientists seem to be finding some ways that biotech firms allow for more equity than in more hierarchical settings. All right, so I always get asked what's going on now. And so I had the privilege of being able to be an outside reader on a recent dissertation that was just filed by Janine Pickering at Swinburne University in Australia. And in her research on Australian biotech, she found much the same thing that I did in the United States long ago, that there was, and she actually had salary data and showed that there were significant gender gaps in pay in academia that were not there in biotech firms. She also found authority gaps, like I did, in academia, but not in biotech firms. Now, the one thing that her study raised for me, though, and I think would be interesting to talk about maybe during the later discussion, is that in both academia and industry, she found that jobs were much more precarious now than they were at the time I was studying. So we have fewer tenure-track jobs. It's much harder to get them. I don't have to tell you the statistics about how long it takes for life scientists to get their first NIH award if they're academics. And so I think that's something to think about, too, is the larger political economy in which biotech is operating. All right, so just a few thoughts to end with. One practical implication of this research is that environment matters. Organizations that foster transparency, collaborative flexibility, and collective rewards, rather than a rigid chain of command, foster equity and innovation. But also the general economic climate matters. If flexibility happens to mean that none of us have job security, then that is not necessarily a good trade-off. Another implication is that the rules and practices of organizations should not be taken for granted or thought to be genderless. Awareness matters, so unconscious bias flourishes when it's hidden, and so we need to be sort of aware of what the structures are leading to. And finally, I just want to make the point that diversity matters. Not all women are the same, and so we need further support for foreign-born women scientists. So in that study of immigrant founders, almost all of them were men. And so I think we need to think more about the intersection of nationality and race and gender. So thank you so much for your attention.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you here. And it's a real privilege and pleasure to be here. So I'm going to be talking to you from maybe the sort of the operational side of the business. It's so inspiring and somewhat daunting to be surrounded by people who've devoted their lives to really studying in depth and understanding the detail of the experience that I simply live day to day. So I don't offer you a lot of real data, but I offer you a lot of years of experience of living in the biotech and pharma world. And so, you know, I think we all know that there is a paucity of women. We have many qualified women, but we don't have them in the leadership positions. And it's across the organizations, really. It goes right from the board of directors through the C-suite to the senior management, but indeed not really at the entry level. And I'll talk a little bit about that in different settings that I've worked in. I'm one of those people in pharma and biotech whose careers sort of gone backwards, from working at a very large company, Sandoz and Novartis, for 17 years, to a more middle-sized company, Millennium, where I was the CEO, and now I'm at a much smaller company, Forum. So I've gone smaller and smaller and smaller. And I do see the differences for women in those larger hierarchical organizations. I was saying, wow, there it is. It's there. It's been studied. And I've lived it. And when I think about large organizations like Novartis, there, first of all, there's a lot of people. And in those organizations, the entry level is actually probably more women than men. Now, interestingly, we have to then start to separate out. That includes both the scientific disciplines and the commercial and what we call G&A disciplines, the general and administration, finance, HR, communications. And when I think about my own experience, where the women are, we're coming more into those commercial and G&A disciplines. And I think, Liz, you pointed it out, HR, communications, some of those entry level on finance side, lots of women. On the sales side, in the commercial sales functions for big pharma and for biotech, by the way, commercial biotech, probably more women than men. And that extends around the world. I was on the board of Takeda Pharmaceuticals in Japan, and if we think we have a gender diversity problem, Japan is truly staggering for where their women are versus where our women are. But even there, the entry level for the company at the sales force side is 52% women. And so when we look at the scientific side, we do see that even at the entry level, we've got less women coming into those jobs. So the sciences are probably in big pharma imbalanced to the tune of maybe instead of being 50%, it's more like 30%. And I think that's probably true in biotech too. When I look at the entry-level scientists and I think about who I've seen in my experience. So one of the things we need to understand is why even at the entry level is that true? Where we know how many women are qualifying and achieving at the level that could bring them into those jobs, having finished. Usually we're hiring people who've completed postdocs into those scientific disciplines in the lab, in the clinic. And particularly in the lab sciences, we're seeing less women at the entry level. In the clinical disciplines, actually it's not true. So in regulatory affairs, in clinical development, pharmacovigilance, we're actually seeing more women. You'd probably see at the entry level, clinical operations, you'd probably see 60% women. So there's definitely more of an issue in my own experience in those hard science, lab science, PhD science areas than there are in the clinical sciences, where we're recruiting people who've been nurses, people with bachelor's degrees in biology, into those more clinical disciplines. And as we go into biotech, we do see more women in the labs, and we see more women rising up in lab management, but still not at the rate that's equivalent to their proportion, even at the entry level. So there's still a problem even in biotech, but certainly there are more. I can verify from the operational side that the research is absolutely factual. There's more of a chance for a woman to lead a lab in biotech than there is in big pharma. And that just exaggerates as we go up. So then I ask myself, so really, where are the women? What's happening to them? What's taking them out of the experience? And I think if I maybe for that start at the C-suite, and I say, okay, what takes women out of the C-suite? Why don't they get there? And one of the issues is, where do they come into organizations, right? So for an organization, you've got to have to run the organization, you've got to have experience in the main line functions of the organization. And those in a pharma, in a biotech, include, to some extent, the research, a lot more the clinical, and then the financial. I'd say those are some of the most critical, and then of course the commercial. So some of the places where women tend to go in these organizations, into communications, HR, to the general counsel or the legal aspect, are not the paths that most typically lead you to have the experiences that lead to the CEO level. Will lead to the C-suite as the general counsel, the chief human resources officer, but it won't take you to the CEO role. So what I often find myself advising women is you have to be doing the work that is most critical in the pillars of the corporation. So figure out where that is. I think another thing that I've observed career-wise over years of advising women and versus men, because I obviously have advised a lot of men also, is that women have a tendency to perfectionism. And so they want mastery before they believe they're ready to take on something different. And men don't have the same need for 100% mastery. They feel that once they're at sort of the 80% level, it's time to add more, move on, get a different experience. So that for me has been an interesting observation of the different genders, and they're broad generalizations. I can only give you what I've observed, but they do hold true. And what that leads to for women is a couple of things. One is that they keep their heads down and they get the work done, and they believe that good work will be noticed and tapped on the shoulder. And believe me, good work is absolutely noticed, and people are very grateful for it. But it doesn't necessarily get advanced. What has to happen is people have to ask for and make known their desires for advancement. And women are much less comfortable with that in general than men. They feel, if my boss thinks I'm good enough, he'll, because they're often he's, will advance me. And I often say to them, maybe we need you to send you out into the sales force for a while to learn that, things don't just happen. And the quieter you are, the more people will believe you're satisfied with where you are and simply leave you there doing beautiful work that they love to rely on. So men will tend to ask more. The other thing that I observe is that women are carrying often two jobs, right? They're handling a lot on the home front, and they're handling a lot on the work front. So they tend to come in, get their work done, and be going to, relieve the babysitter, make sure that the meal is taken care of, that their home life is in order. And so they don't take as many opportunities networking. And I think, some of these are on my next slide versus, in the what do we do category. And so I'll often advise women, you do need to be able to devote time to enabling people to know you in a setting that isn't just your single job. So the concept of networking, and I'm not talking about playing golf. I'm really talking about going to industry conferences, going to industry events, going to your specialty conference, whatever it is you're in, where you'll meet people who are further ahead in their journey in that particular career. Being in this type of environment, there are so many places where one can interact with other people, particularly in the biotech and pharma space, who are at a different stage of their career, but you have to be able to devote some of the time to that. And I find that women versus men tend to balance their time differently and balance their priorities differently, because we all only have 24 hours in every day. So I think that, you know, that's one of the observations I've had, and I'd say to people a lot along the way: build your base of experience, getting into roles that are pivotal to the corporation, externally facing, so that they do take you out of the office, that represent the corporation, and then really getting budget-oriented roles. So owning a budget, whether it's, and that's from very sub-departments within the big scientific areas, the clinical ops area, not only in the finance area, right? Those are not the only people who manage budgets. So managing budgets and managing people, even if they're small groups, very important experiences. And then seek out those role models and take advice from them. You know, I had a thought as you were talking, Monica, about the Baxter boys, and I don't know very much about them, but what flashes into my mind is once they've seen one of their colleagues do it, it's much easier to imagine yourself doing it. And I think that's what we've had as a difficulty for women, is they haven't seen how it's done. You know, when I came to Millennium 10 years ago, I think I was probably the only female CEO at that time in the biotech space, probably not ever, but just at that moment. Now I can count up, there's probably 11 or 12 that I personally know. And that creates the beginnings of the role modeling for other women to say, hey, Nancy Simonian, she's the CEO at Syros. I know she's a doc. I know her, I've come across her, I can go and talk to her. And seeking that out is really, really, really important. Becoming an external thought leader. If you're in an organization, become part of your trade association, your scientific group, and be a thought leader. Become a program advisor, or take on a role that puts you out in front, where your voice is heard, because people search on that when they're recruiting for boards, for lab heads, for all of those kind of things. And then network across the sectors, academia to the venture capital to industry to the clinical sector. We've got a unique ecosystem, but you can't just stay in your own little world. Networking across those, and there really are great opportunities for it here, I think is important to broaden the mind and to help women see what opportunities are out there. And I think the other thing that women don't tend to do is specifically ask for advice at a particular time. Now, I don't think about mentors as people who are constantly, you know, with you along your career. That can be so, but often it's just at a point in time. I'd like to advance my career from a physician on a project to a chief medical officer. Speak to a chief medical officer, ask about their career progression, see what you can learn. So it can be a very time-bound thing to get mentoring. And then specifically seeking board experiences. Again, sometimes women wait to be tapped. But if they go, I'd urge people to go out and ask for what you want. Speak to people you know who are running a company and say, gee, I'm really interested in being on a board. Help me understand, what would I have to do that? What are my gaps? Why isn't it possible for me? And I find with a lot of senior women, I have to say to them, gosh, you know, you're a chief human resources officer, but that isn't what board governance looks for. It looks for line experience. Getting that advice earlier in her career might have been pretty helpful to that lady. Ask the question. And then for women who are in the sciences and who come up with innovation and patents, or the potential for patents, go and seek advice. Go to a boot camp. Go to get some training in entrepreneurship. It's out there, particularly here in Boston. And then if you have to, learn by interning, not giving up your full-time job, but offering to help at a company or a venture capital firm. Hey, can I come alongside? And it is nights and weekends, and that's sometimes a problem for women, but come alongside and offer to help you'll learn while you do it. So those are some of the things that I've experienced over the years that can help. But I think women need to express their wants and be prepared to take that flyer that men are often prepared to take, where women will shy back from it and wait to be asked. Ladies, we can't wait to be asked. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes. Oh, that's really good. It is such an honor and humbling privilege to be here, following two academic legends and an industry legend, and then there's me. My name is Alison Wood-Brooks. I am a faculty member at the Harvard Business School across the river. I'm so honored to be here at the gorgeous Radcliffe Institute. I've never been here before. It's just beautiful, and I've never received such organized and enthusiastic emails. So thank you all for coming today. It's a privilege. Our job on this panel is to talk about the problem. So the title of my talk today is Why Are Women Underrepresented as Leaders? And I'm going to provide you with two ideas from my own research. First, are women really underrepresented in high-level positions? We heard some amazing data from Liz on this, so I'm going to just repeat it to make sure that we're all on the same page. The answer is yes. Less than 20% of full professors in the natural sciences are women. Less than 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Less than 15% of executive officers are women. And less than 11% of US firms with VC backing, so that's funding for their companies, have been founded or led by women. So the answer is yes, women are underrepresented. Liz also said an interesting stat that companies that are led with 3 or more women on their executive boards tend to perform better. I have a colleague who's doing research right now looking at the board compositions at Fortune 500 companies and the gender and racial compositions. What she's found is that there's something magical about the number 2 women on a board. It's bad to have 0 because then you're obviously failing at diversity. It's bad to have 1 because then you have the 1 token woman. So right now in our culture, the thing is to have 2 women on your board. So just something to think about. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about 2 ideas about why we're facing this gender gap at the top. And I want to provide you with a framework to think about the problem. It's comprised of 2 factors. The first category of factors I'm going to call demand-side factors. This is how people perceive and react to women in the workplace. A psychologist might call this interpersonal factors, how we perceive women and react to them. The other category I'm going to call supply-side factors. This is what a psychologist might call intrapsychic. It's what's going on in women's minds themselves. It's how women think and behave in the workplace. So I'm going to talk about 2 projects, 1 in each category. The first falls into this category of demand-side factors, how people perceive and react to women in the workplace. So the first paper asks, is there gender-based discrimination in entrepreneurship? So this is a specific context. To address this question in our research, we analyzed the entrepreneurial pitches given at the 3 largest entrepreneurial pitch competitions across the United States for 3 years. Compared to the female entrepreneurs in our sample, male entrepreneurs were 60% more likely to achieve success. Success meant winning the competition, getting funding for their company. Okay, so it wasn't just that they were men, they were also handsome. Okay, so physically attractive men were significantly more likely to get funding than were the ugly ducklings. And that's compared to all women, right? So physical attractiveness didn't matter at all for the women. It's like you see a girl pitching a company and you dismiss her out of hand because she's a woman, but then I'm really going to focus on these men. And when I see, the Tom Brady pitching the company, that's the winner. Okay, so this is what we call correlational data. it's not causation, because it's just observational in the world. So as scientists, we want to establish causation. Is being a man actually causing you to get funding? So we wanted to do this experimentally in the lab as well, because it's possible that maybe handsome men really are better at pitching their companies. So let's find out. We asked 600 people to watch a series of entrepreneurial pitch videos in a controlled web-based experiment, and here's how we set it up. They heard either a female voice or a male voice narrating each pitch video, and we only manipulated the narrator's gender by hearing the voice of a man or a woman, or their physical attractiveness, because we presented photos of them, and they were pre-rated as high or low attractiveness. And the content of the pitches was identical. They saw the same video, the same images, the same graphs, the script was identical. We even trained the vocal actors to do the same inflections as they read the pitch script. And then the participants chose which company they wanted to fund with their own real money. So they had their own skin in the game. Here's what we found. Same pattern of results as in the entrepreneurial pitch competition. When you heard a man narrating the pitch video and saw an attractive photo of him, people were much more likely to invest in that company than when they saw the ugly duckling, male, or when they saw either an attractive female or an unattractive female. So now we've got causal evidence of this effect. So here's the summary. Male entrepreneurs, especially attractive ones, are more likely to receive investor funding than are female entrepreneurs. This is based on their gender and their physical attractiveness and not on the content of their ideas. Okay, so this is an example of a demand-side factor. Here we're seeing very stark gender discrimination in entrepreneurship. When people ask us why we find these findings, we've posited that there's this sort of lack of fit. When we imagine a successful entrepreneur, we imagine a handsome, assertive man, and we do not imagine a woman. This goes back to Deborah's point. There just aren't a lot of role models. We're not imagining a woman as an entrepreneur, and then when we see a woman pitch a company, there's this lack of fit. You don't seem like an entrepreneur, so I'm not going to invest in you. So for the second idea that I'm going to share with you today, we're going to shift to the other category, supply-side factors. This is what I called intrapsychic, in your own mind. So what's going on in women's minds? How does it affect how they think and behave in the workplace? So the second paper asks, do men and women view professional advancement differently? This paper is coming out in like 2 days, so keep your eyes peeled in the media. Okay, so I want to do a little thought experiment with all of you. If I asked you, what are your core goals in life? And by core goals, I mean things that occupy your thoughts, things that you deeply care about, or things that motivate your behavior and decisions. So right now, just kind of close your eyes and think about it. What are your core goals in life? If I were to answer this question, I would say something like, I want to be a supportive spouse, I want to take great care of my 6-month-old baby, I want to successfully breastfeed, I want to publish papers, I want to run every day, I want to stay fit, I want to be in fashion and be stylish, I want to be a good friend, a good daughter, etc. The list goes on and on. So we asked a huge sample of people this question, and women listed more goals than men overall. A smaller proportion of women's goals were related to achieving power at work. And these findings held whether people made a list of their goals, whether we asked them to select goals from a list that we created, a predetermined list, or whether we asked people to reject goals that were not important to them from our predetermined list. So this finding is very robust. Women are listing many more things, and therefore it makes sense that they have less time and attention to devote to any one of those goals, including their work-related goals. This finding is probably making you feel a little bit angry at me, but I want you to hold on to that anger, and I'm excited to have a discussion. Okay, so here's the second part of this paper. I want you to imagine you're offered a promotion for a higher power position at work. And for the undergrads in the audience, imagine that you're offered a great high power position after graduation. Now, if I asked you to rate how much you expect each of these outcomes to come along with that promotion, what would you say? And we provided these outcomes to our participants when they thought about promotion. Some of them were negative, like stress or anxiety, difficult trade-offs, burden or responsibility, and conflict with other life goals, and some of them were positive, like job satisfaction, money, status, power. Here's what we found. Men and women reported equivalent levels of positive reactions. So when men and women are imagining the same good things to come out of high power positions, but women are thinking of more negative things. Men and women rated the promotion as equally attainable, amazing, but women rated the promotion as less desirable. This follows logically. If you're imagining more negative outcomes to be associated with the promotion is therefore less desirable to you. Compared to men, women are less likely to actually accept the promotion. Before I go on, I just want to say this was across 9 studies with over 4,000 participants, women of all different levels. We had executives who are currently in high power positions, average working adults, and college students, undergraduate women. So it seems like a very pervasive effect. So there is a big, fat, juicy disclaimer that I want to say along with these findings. These findings are descriptive, not prescriptive. That means that we don't know if these participants are right or wrong. They just are. These are their preferences right now. It's possible that men and women are correctly predicting the unique experiences they're poised to encounter when they reach positions of power, or women are overestimating the negative consequences associated with power, or men are underestimating the negative consequences associated with power. We don't know the answer to that. It's extremely important, and I hope that people in the audience will do the research to answer those questions. Okay, so why are women underrepresented as leaders? I provided you with 2 ideas here, 2 examples, I should say. One was a demand-side factor. Entrepreneurs face gender discrimination. People are less likely to invest in pitches given by women. I also gave you a supply-side factor example. Women want different things in life. It turns out they want more things, which means they have less time and attention to devote to their work-related goals. And it's important to note that demand-side factors influence supply-side factors, and supply-side factors influence demand-side factors. They're not independent. They are inextricably linked. If I see a high-power woman being mistreated, it will make me have different preferences, and then how I behave will influence how people around me view women generally and how they react to them. So that is the end. I want to say thank you so much to my co-authors and to all of you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I've been taking notes. I have so many questions, but I'm going to be brief. Okay, so I'm going to restrict myself and think about questions that cross a little bit. Okay. So starting with Laurel. So Laurel, I noticed, you were taking notes throughout as well. We academics. But anyway, so as you were listening to Deborah, I mean, some of her arguments have to do with, she said pipeline, but different roles that individuals, women, take versus men. And so I was wondering in your own research or the doctoral students' research, whether you saw differences either within academia in particular, that's really where a lot of your work has been, or biotech, because most of your research was juxtaposing the two, whether there are differences within the roles that people take on, whether there's anything we can learn from there, whether it's, biology versus chemistry, or there are different kinds of pieces to the puzzle that have to do with roles rather than the larger opportunity structured networks versus hierarchies that might lend insight into the problem from your perspective.
Okay. And so do you want me to answer, or are you going to?
No, I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
To answer that, yeah.
Great.
Just you.
And right now.
Yeah.
I want to follow the protocol, right? Great, that's a great question, thanks. And I was really fascinated by Deborah's discussion about the difference between line and staff, which of course is really important to understanding who makes it up into leadership roles. But something else that your comments made me think about, especially juxtaposing the HR, sort of legal kinds of roles with the more scientific roles, is I think really an interesting question about something that sociologists study a lot, which is gender segregation. And so we know that occupational segregation is a huge amount of what accounts for the pay gap. And so in my study, which I should have clarified, I was looking just at life science PhDs. So I was only looking at people who had their PhDs and comparing people who have the same qualifications, and many of whom are from the same doctoral programs in academia and in pharma and in biotech. But I think that this question about how do we segregate, and it also relates to what Alison was just saying about how do we self-segregate too. So there's a lot of interesting research, for example, a study by sociologist Maria Charles that finds that in international studies of how do women choose majors in less developed countries, women are much more likely to go for engineering and natural sciences. But when there's more of a choice, right, that's when women choose to go into social sciences and humanities. And so there's something about the structure in which we're making our choices and sort of self-segregating that needs further examination, is what I would say.
Great, thanks, very helpful, very helpful. Deborah, I can't help but ask the question with the setup and the introduction that we had about the optimism. And you are clearly somebody who's optimistic, and yet also listening to Alison and even your own remarks about women not seeking out help, not sponsoring, self-sponsorship, or seeing the negative side and so forth. And, what thoughts do you have on, and I know this bleeds over into the second session, so I apologize, but I know that's where you're at and what we can learn from. What are your thoughts on, maintaining that optimism, first of all, which clearly you have, and secondly, do you see changes over the years? Are you optimistic, I guess?
Well, I think I'm an optimist by nature, so let's just say that. But I do see changes over the years, and one of the changes that I am really encouraged by, I'm not sure it's getting exactly to this panel, is the change in young men, and young men, young compared to me. Not necessarily that young, but are much more interested in balanced life. So I'm seeing more young men who will want the type of work that allows them to do some of the things with their family that make them say, no, I don't necessarily, just want a bigger job. I want to be a part of my children's life. And they also, in that upcoming generation, there are more families with two working spouses where trade-offs have to be made. And it's not always the woman who's trading anymore, as it used to be, maybe at least 20 years ago. That's definitely evolved over time. So I think we're moving into a time where both women and men might have, and unfortunately your research is making a liar of me, that maybe women and men are going to have more goals. And it was so interesting, your work is so interesting, and it resonates with me because I think about it and I think of the context in which men make those decisions often is the context of, I can think about the upsides because I'm not trading away as many downsides because there's somebody else in my life who takes care of making sure my kids are great and everything's functioning and they're getting fabulous input and I feel like our family ecosystem together with my often non-working spouse and me are that ecosystem is stable, so they can focus on much more so, and pop psychology probably, and you can all criticize me, but I'm not the academic. And maybe it will shift a bit more over time. And I think women are, you know, I've made decisions in my career where I wouldn't go for the bigger job because of the mother I wanted to be. Not because my husband isn't fabulously supportive and absolutely, you know, would have helped me make it happen, but because of who I wanted to be for my children. So commuting. You know, yeah, we want to keep our high schoolers in one place, and, you know, many people, never mind just men and women, will make a decision to commute. I didn't want to, and it was nothing to do with my husband and his support. So I don't feel victimized or put upon. It was me. I wanted to be there. So yes, we do make decisions with a bigger, you know, the broad set of goals and keeping what we want in balance. And that, I just feel that's great. So I want women always to feel empowered to make the decision. There's no absolute need to always want the bigger job. But if you want it, we need to create the ecosystem where you can go for it as a woman. And it's not just going to be your voice or your looks or your gender that has you dismissed.
Right. Takes a village, really. Alison, so I know you haven't done work specifically in this area, but now you've been thinking about, you know, the particulars. And I'm just wondering if you can, you know, just riff with us a little bit. Like, if you thought about kind of the wonderful social psych experiments and that you've seen or you've done yourself, is there anything about this context that you can think about that might make it either particularly, like, put it kind of an accent at the end of some of your results, or maybe, you know, maybe it isn't quite so stark in this context? And we know you haven't, you know, you're not specifically studying this, but we'd still love to hear, you know, the benefits of your thinking as you're absorbing this.
Absolutely. I think the entrepreneurship findings are particularly relevant for this audience because I think the effect would be particularly strong in contexts that are sort of hard sciences. There's a lot of math, complexity, uncertainty. It's in contexts like that where these quick go-to discriminatory rules, people use them more often. So for example, imagine a woman is pitching a makeup company. People would be more likely to listen to her in that context as opposed to pitching some pharmaceutical drug or another biotech type of idea that one might say traditionally or historically is a sort of male-typed context. The lack of fit between the entrepreneur and the content is even more dramatic. But that means that the opportunity to be a badass and be a star in those domains is even larger.
Excellent. Another optimist on the panel. Okay. We turn now to you for your questions. So just line up right at the mic. Make sure you just state your name, your affiliation, and you can direct your question to one or more of our panelists. Thank you.
I'm Joanne Cammons, the head of Adgene and nonprofit Biotech. So I've been able to take both my women's desire to do women-like nonprofit-y things and lead a biotech. So, you know, finding that middle balance. Alison, I guess this is mostly for you, but I think for all the panelists, I was very interested in everything you said, but the intersection between the supply side and the demand side factors. So I speak to hundreds of women scientists every year. I do career speaking for postdocs. And what I see is, my question is the implicit bias toward how women should behave as moms and as women, speaking quietly, politely, raising their children as the primary parent, all those things, is that affecting women's desires, do you think? Or is it women's desires that are the problem? So we say to women, you need to learn how to golf, you need to ask, we have to ask more, we have to, you know, do all these things to overcome the bias. But has the bias caused, like, am I supposed to feel guilty? I don't. Maybe that's why I've been successful in my career. I got a husband, he can do half, you know. But so many women I know, they feel guilty and the men don't. Even the ones who are starting to contribute 50-50, they don't feel guilty. Is that society telling us, or is that how we are?
Oh. Thank you.
Such a deep question. I wish I knew the answer. I think my intuition is that the bias is making us feel that way because this research is a snapshot of our culture right now, And, you know, if we were to run those same studies 50 years ago or 50 years from now, I think and hope that we would have found very different results 50 years ago, and I hope that we find different results in 50 years. Right now, I think we're still in a time of cultural shift gender-wise. It was not that long ago that, you know, women could be nurses or teachers or nothing, or a stay-at-home mom. So I think we're still in a dramatic time of cultural shift, and right now, I think the guilt that women feel is likely a result of bias and not the other way around. But I think the scientifically correct answer is we don't know.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jenny Harden-Kohler, and I'm actually a psychologist. I run my own talent management and executive coaching firm, and I'm actually in the process of conducting some qualitative research right now with rising women scientists, because I do a lot of coaching in this space and have seen a lot of women feeling stuck at that middle management level, so looking at some of these factors. And Alison, my question is for you, because your comment about do they want to get to that next level that's one of the questions I'm looking at, motivating and demotivating factors, as well as organizational systems that support or impede. And part of what I'm hearing is the women say they want influence, they want to expand their impact, they want to do good work and feel satisfied, but they are very concerned about the trade-offs. They are concerned about the work-life balance. And my question for you is in your research, did you find any age-related changes? So in the 20s, are the concerns less in terms of the negatives? Are they a little bit less worried about the time factor, the travel issues, et cetera?
Great. Excellent. Okay,
Yeah.
and I'd love to hear from Deborah on this as well.
You want to go first, Deborah?
No, go right ahead.
So we had the same hypothesis, which is why we went after high-level executives, working adults, and college kids. College students. And we thought that college students would have sort of more progressive views, and maybe they hadn't been infiltrated by biases quite yet. But it seems like we didn't even go young enough with our sample. Even college students are thinking ahead to what's my life going to be like as a working adult. In fact, I think women in college in particular, it's really on their minds about how am I going to be a high-powered CEO and have a beautiful, wonderful family. And I don't think the answers are clear, probably because of what Deborah was saying, there aren't a lot of role models.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. And I think that what I often have to say to people is, you know, they say, well, you know, I want to be home with my family. I don't want to take a job in another city that's better because I've got my support systems here. And that's great and fine, but what I counsel them is you need to own up to what that costs you, right? You can't ask to have the same experience at the end of it as the man, often, who has made those moves, has gathered those extra experiences, has been out there being a thought leader, being prepared to travel on the weekend. So you will be very delayed. So when you're in your kids are self-sufficient and you want to do that, you will not have the experience base. So let's just all be clear about that, because it is in that way a meritocracy, not exclusively, there are biases, but at a minimum, the women have to have the same levels of experience. You can't do it with less.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for being with us here today. My name is Zachariah Sherbini, and I am a master's student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Prior to coming to HGSC, I was an early childhood teacher, teaching primarily pre-K and K. And I saw in the classroom how both boys and girls already had such a strong socialized sense of gender norms. Whether it's this color is for girls, or boys can't play this, or you can't play with me because you are a boy or girl. And I always, I was mindful of these, and I always struggled with how to effectively encourage the right kinds of interpersonal skills, so that when they grew up, that they would be able, both genders would have a chance to succeed professionally. So I really had that in mind long term. So my question is, what specific interpersonal skills and internalizations are necessary for young girls to be able to succeed eventually in the workplace?
Thoughts on that?
I'll dive in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of them is confidence in being able to speak up. What I find with women frequently is that they will offer a perspective in almost an apologetic way. Sometimes there's a physical apology. I had to take one woman aside and say, "Stop presenting like this. Stand up and face your audience." And so there's physical attributes that come along with it. There's vocal and verbalization attributes. Women will say, "I feel." Men will say, "I think," or "I know." And I don't know where those come from, but they're pretty prevalent. So I think that confidence, the ability to speak clearly and articulately in a debate and to take on conflict, not in a combative way, but to feel comfortable defending a point of view. Now, I'm talking to rooms full of PhDs who've all defended dissertations, so you know how to do that. But in a argument where you're not the expert necessarily, how do you feel comfortable holding on to a point of view? How do you feel comfortable insisting on being heard? Because women will often back off when somebody interrupts them. Men simply don't allow it to happen or will come back at it. So there are, I think, behaviors that we can help our young women right from the very elementary learn, and practices that we can teach them to help them. It can't overcome all the bias, but it can sure help.
Laurel has some thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm working on a paper right now in the chemical sciences that looks at lab presentations of graduate student men and women, and we found a very large crisis of confidence in the women graduate students. But the context matters, right? And so we find that the PIs are interrupting the women and helping them, right? Answering for them. They don't do that for the male students. There's also this joking manner that they have with the male students, like, oh, you know, it's very light and it's very serious for the women students. And so the situation, the interactional situation, is different for the women students than it is for the men. So I would say that teachers maybe need to think about what kinds of classroom contexts they're creating, that it's not just on the students. So I come from Amherst, right, and in our public schools there, which, you know, are very kind of gender non-normative place in Massachusetts, you know, the boys and girls play soccer together all the way through elementary school, and, you know, that's not in all places. So if you have that less gender segregation at the early level, I'm curious to see what happens with, I'm hoping those girls will then, you know, be able to forge new paths later on too. So thanks for your question.
Helpful, thank you. Yep.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna ask you guys to keep it brief because we're clicking down on time and I see a long line there.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. Renee Vaslos, I'm in the private sector in a hierarchical environment, so I see that perspective. And so my question is for Deborah. Monica said that it requires a village, but before it requires a village, we've identified who it requires. It's the people in power in the hierarchical. That's where the majority of the jobs are. But when we look who's here, they're not here. So how do we get them to be engaged and part of this conversation?
Yeah, I think it's a. No, but I think the question is the male CEOs of corporations, why are they not here? And I think they are being alerted to it, and within their own companies need to take action. So I think what we need to do is go to the business sector and have the same kind of meetings within the business sector as well. Yeah. So that we're attacking it on all levels.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anna Ward, and I was most recently Senior Vice President and General Counsel of a company where I also headed HR, so up through the pink career ladder. I love pink, by the way. But because I hit the ceiling as GC and they wouldn't allow me to get operational experience, which is a problem, I'm going to launch my own company here as an entrepreneur. And so,
Go, girl.
Alison, your data, though interesting, doesn't offer any solutions to the entrepreneurial, other than to hire a hot young guy, which I'm totally open to, by the way, okay?
Could be fun. Yeah.
I'm just saying.
I can just see the Twitter feed like that.
But given that, and I believe it, I don't doubt that there's a problem, but I want to focus on the solutions. And so what I would ask is, what would you advise me as a female entrepreneur launching a company here in Boston?
Hire a hot young guy. No, it's an excellent question. This is the question that keeps me up at night and why this type of research is slightly dissatisfying, because it's easy to identify problems. It's a lot harder to identify solutions. I'm going to punt that question because the next panel is talking all about solutions to these kinds of problems.
We probably also need other people on the other side. I noticed in your picture, all the judges.
Correct.
Unless that was just happened to be the case, but yeah.
My name is Cassandra Smith. I'm founder of Athena Biomedical Research Organization, focused on prevention of mental illness through nutritional interventions and with early detection of inborn errors of metabolism, and I don't know why I'm so nervous.
You're among friends.
Hi. My question, and some of this is anecdotal, but I noticed that there were very few American women who were on editorial boards of journals. And in fact, who were, and what do I want to say, American women, like third, fourth, etc. generations. For instance, when most of this is anecdotal observations, but when Dan Koshland was chief editor of Science, he had 100 people on the editorial board. 90 were men, 10% of those were at foreign institutions. He had 10 women, 90% of those were at foreign institutions. And so that kind of says to me that are these men in science really, they can deal more easily with these foreign women? And I've seen it in other situations. Are they doing this because it's easier to deal with these women than to deal with us?
Wow.
Okay. So there's work by Katrina Zippel, who is an expert sociologist at Northeastern here, and she's done some work that looks at the intersection of nationality and gender. And so her research shows some of what you're saying, that the interaction context is very different for women who are from foreign countries who are scientists than for domestic women scientists. So.
And so I think that's somehow how people are interacting. One fast question. What about tallness?
What about what? I'm sorry.
Tallness, height.
Height.
Yes.
I'm so fascinated by height.
I actually noticed this in biotech. Seriously.
Very high heels. No, I know. It's a variable that actually could matter a lot. We haven't even looked at that yet.
Great, thanks.
Hi, my name is Laurel Wright. I'm a PhD student in biology at MIT. And Deborah, some of the characteristics and actions that you were talking about, when I think about that anecdotally, some of these badass women, I think sometimes are perceived differently than men who
Are badass.
Are badass. And I was wondering from the sociologists if there are data that kind of support that idea. Like, women who have these certain characteristics, are they discriminated against in a different way than men who have the same kind of characteristics?
Alison, you might want to take this. There's lab studies on
Yeah. So there. First, I want to say that truly badass women who make it to the top get a sort of perceptual boost because people realize that they've navigated all of these landmines and persisted and succeeded. There is actually a boost in respect and perceptions of competence for women who can go and pitch their ideas and succeed, and women who kind of navigate their way through all of these biases and discriminatory things. There's a lot of research about backlash, is what you're describing. Women who display agentic or assertive behaviors are seen as bitchy and cold, and men who display agentic and assertive behaviors are seen as leaders. This is the sort of baseline type of gender research that we know is happening right now in our culture.
Deborah, have you seen this work? I mean, you clearly have. So thinking about the social context in which women are displaying agentic and assertive behaviors, what are the conditions under which that actually does work? Because it's clear that a lot of people here are thinking about, how can either we could create the context, as my sociologist friend here would say, or how can we change behavior, as my social psychologist friend would say. So I'm just wondering if you've seen kind of the marrying of the two, and under what conditions?
I think the answer is not going to help a whole lot, and where I see it function best is when you get past the tipping point in organizations where there's not that tiny minority of women. So when there's more of a balance within organizations, you see that there's the same spectrum of women as there are of men in terms of their behavior. Sometimes somebody who's outspoken and assertive is a bitch, excuse me. Others are not. And it's the same with men. Some of the assertive behaviors are actually very productive and functional, and some of them aren't in organizations. But you can only see that and not get the, one generalization when there's a more of a balance. So finding a place when you're examining potentially a career in industry, being in a place and actually observing what is the gender balance, you're more likely to be able to manifest those behaviors without as much backlash if there is more gender balance within the organization. Just as a top of my head comment.
Thanks. Great.
Hi, my name is Renee Dehan-Kenny. I'm head of research at a small biotech here in Cambridge that focuses on biological data sciences. And this has been very engaging and has gotten me thinking about the constitution of the management team of my company over the last 10 years that I've been there. And it's gone from 0% women to 50% women, which is fantastic. I think it's a very meritocracy-driven organization. There have been 5 women on the management team. And one of the things that I noticed was out of this 5, 4 of us have come up through the ranks. So we started at entry-level positions, and my question is really, is that a requirement for women in leadership positions? Must we demonstrate our capabilities within the organization in order to attain that level?
I'm trying to think through very quickly my experience of the women that I know that are in very senior positions. And I think there are a predominance of them that have been with the companies a long time, but there are definitely more in the last maybe 5 years that have been hired in from the outside. So perhaps that's in my teeny tiny insignificant data sample. There's a bit of a shift that women can actually move now into those more leadership positions.
I actually did a study on this at Abbott about 10 years ago. From our ranks, there were hundreds of women there, and I led a study because no women were getting promoted into group leader positions from within. They were all being hired from without. And we did a study, both a perception study, only on one company, and an actual looking at the numbers. And the reasons turned out to be that if you came into a company when you were early in your career and you didn't display the features that you needed, you were remembered as that little girl. No matter how much you had accomplished, the perception was you were still that little girl that you came in as 10 years ago, and you were never going to get promoted. And so what happened So you were never going to get promoted from within. And all these women were being hired from without until we pointed it out. And then leadership changed some of their criteria for promotion and attempted to put in some transparency and bureaucracy to allow women to be promoted from within. And 2 women were then, the year later, promoted to group leader. So, but we had to demand it. Demand it.
Provide evidence. Yeah, yeah. Great question.
Hi. I got the hygiene, lucky me. So I'm Lisa Levy. I'm a long-term diversity consultant with a lot of deep expertise in gender norms and gender roles. So I have a question is, why don't we ever ask about why men say, I can't be the father I want to be? It's amazing that that's not a part of our conversation even all these years in, because even if you have someone else doing it all, you're not doing it, and you can only get that one-on-one, even more so, I would argue, with your family than what you could do at work. So that's a question I just love your feedback on. And the second question is, what responsibility do you think men have, given we know organizations are profoundly privileged towards men? We wouldn't have the data over all the years, and that's not changing at the very top. What responsibility do you think men have to be allies or to do something proactively to whatever, make it more equitable?
So I'm going to give our panelists the choice of answering one of your questions. I think the first one may be broader than perhaps this panelist would even choose to speak to, but you have the choice if you'd like to address one of them.
I'll address the first one.
Excellent.
Okay. So masculinity studies show that the male gender role is a lot stricter than the female gender role. So, you know, girls can be tomboys, but boys can't be sissies. And so transgressing that, there's a lot more punishment that men face. And so I think that's also true for fatherhood probably as well, that transgressing the work role, there's probably something.
And the second one, I'll be very brief. I think the responsibility for men is a responsibility to the business. And I'll come back to the performance of companies. This is not a fairness issue. It's not, a politeness. This is a business issue. Diversity of all types, gender diversity, racial and ethnicity, we have to, as business leaders, do that. And I think that case has not been sufficiently persuasively communicated.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. We have time for one more question. Okay, so you were on.
I'll be quick.
Thank you.
My name is Paula. I'm a stem cell biologist at Harvard. I'm a postdoc. My question is for Laurel. It's regarding this networks and the hierarchy thing. So I definitely work better in a team. So my question is, do we not like hierarchies, or is it that we never got to the really powerful positions?
Good question. Yeah, I think it looks pretty good from the top when you're in a hierarchy, right? Yeah, and I don't think it's anything that's essential to women, that they're more collaborative. That's not something, at least that I found in my research, but that more collaborative structure allowed for more gender equity. And maybe it's because of the broader culture that we live in, but I like your question.
Sounds like an area for future research. So I'd like to thank our panelists.